All right. Welcome to Jackson Spalding's first Real Talk webinar, How to Communicate During COVID-19. My name is Heather VacLav Hooper, and I'm one of the leaders in our marketing and business development teams. And I'm going to be served as your trusted moderator today. Just want to thank everyone for making time to join us online. Some of you may have attended our in-person Real Talk panel event. And others, this may be your first time joining us. In fact, this is the very first time that Jackson Spalding has done a Real Talk event online, as many of you have had to move events online. So the thing about Real Talk is that our goal is to really just be that, Real Talk. We want to have frank and open conversations, with the panel really being driven by your questions. So we want to have open dialogue without feeling too rigid. Today, we're going to be sharing our crisis communications insights surrounding COVID-19. But most importantly, out of everything we share, we want it to be practical. We want you to be able to have some key takeaways that you can deploy immediately to your team and to your business. Now, before our amazing group of panelists that are on the screen with me today introduce themselves, I do want to say that by sharing our perspectives, we want to be very respectful of our clients at Jackson Spalding, many of which are on this call. So today we're going to be speaking instead to industries and situations without specific brand names. All right, without further ado, let's get ready to introduce this panel and dive into some of our questions. Kim, you want to kick us off?
Sure, thanks so much, Heather. Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Hardcastle. I am a leader on our consumer practice and also a member of the JS Crisis team. And I'm coming to you live from Southern California, where it's 1 p.m.
Hey, this is Bryan Harris. I'm coming to you live from rainy Athens, Georgia, and I've been here at Jackson Spalding for 14 years now, and I serve as a leader on our higher education practice and our sports practice, and also serve many of our crisis clients.
Thanks, Bryan. I'm Charles Edwards. I've been with Jackson Spalding for more than 5 years now, and I'm one of the leaders of the crisis practice, where we really look at before, during, and after the crisis. You must be active. Prior to Jackson Spalding, I was a public radio reporter for about 14 years. And in fact, a lot of our crisis team is comprised of former journalists like myself and also crisis communication practitioners to make sure that we're serving our clients.
You know, Charles, you talk about being former journalists, myself included, and a lot of that, I think, informs the way we approach the stages through a crisis. Can you kind of walk us through exactly what that looks like and where we are today?
Absolutely, Heather. You know, we recently worked a crisis and we came out of it saying there are really 4 phases to that crisis and all crises. It really comes down to the first phase of incoming, and that's where you're getting information overload and you're getting questions from all of your internal and external audiences at a fast pace. Then you have the calming and clarifying phase, where you're past incoming, and the goal is to really calm down the fears that your internal and external audiences have, along with giving clarifying information. And then hopefully after that, you're returning to normal. And when you're returning to normal, you're able to ramp down the crisis communication work, and you're able to ramp back up your normal operations. And then there's moving forward with momentum as the 4th and final phase. Right now, we're all in the incoming phase and have been for the past couple of weeks, because each and every day there's new information that comes in. There are new questions from our internal and external audiences, and we're all trying to handle this rapid pace of information the best we can. So we're really all working together to really focus on the incoming phase right now.
And I think really the incoming phase is where so many of the questions that have been submitted are talking about. So today we're going to talk through a number of the questions that were submitted. We encourage you throughout this time to send us more. You can email them to realtalk@jacksonspalding.com. And if we can't get to them during this time, someone from our crisis team will follow up with you after our webinar. I'm also going to keep us honest on time. We've got 45 minutes locked in. We're going to pack in a ton of information. So let's dive into the first question. What is the role of communications in a crisis like this? Bryan, what do you think?
I'll start with that one, Heather. I think one things that we talk about internally is, as communicators, we need to understand our lanes. We're not legal experts. We're not medical experts. We're not HR experts, but we are experts in helping those people communicate really tough decisions. And in a crisis, clear and concise communications are vital. And we're seeing that now more than ever. And this COVID-19 thing is really one of those, remember where you were when incidents is children of the 80s. We remember where we were when the Challenger went down. We remember where we were when 9/11 happened. Our children are going to remember COVID-19 in that way. And from a communications perspective, we're now living in a 24-hour news cycle. We're now living in a world with constant social media and constant barrage of communications. And our role in this crisis, I see really as four things. One is to inform, and that really is internal. It is making sure that communications leadership is at the table with the CEO, the COO, the HR people, the legal people, and giving a 360 view of what their decisions are going to do and impact the entire organization. And then once those decisions are made, how do we communicate those to our people internally? So we want to inform that decision-making process. Two, we want to educate, and this really is more external. The more we can help our stakeholders understand the why of our business, the why of our decisions, the why of the operational changes, the more we're going to build that relationship. We have seen some fantastic public education campaigns on social distancing, hand washing, staying home, all things that aren't core to many businesses, but they're doing it out of a common good and a greater good. And we're seeing communications lead that. Three, it's really to comfort. This is an unprecedented time, and we are all experiencing this together. And many of us have our heads down and we're in the thick of it, and we feel like this is only happening to us. And from an internal standpoint, the more we as leaders and as communications practitioners can communicate to our audiences internally that they're part of a bigger team, and while they're scattered, they're still working for a common goal. And then externally, understanding that our customers and our stakeholders are hurting right now, and the bond we're building with them now is going to last beyond the crisis. And the final one is communications helps us engage. How we engage with our stakeholders now is different than we did a month ago. And it doesn't mean we disengage, we just must change the rules of engagement. So in the same way that operations have been upended for many businesses and they've adjusted, communications must do the same. And I think that's one of the things we're going to dive into as we go on this afternoon.
Yeah, you're right, Bryan. We received a number of questions that really spoke on all four of those areas. And for many people who are attending today or will be watching after the fact, the question is, how frequently should companies communicate internally to their team, to their employees?
Yeah, so Heather, in a survey of American workers that just came out, we heard that really employees are trusting more than any source their employer to inform them right now. And so going back to Charles' point, we're in that stage where people just need information, and the information is changing rapidly. And employees and the consumers of the United States are trusting their employees to provide them with that, their employers to provide them with that information. And they're preferring that information to come from them over the government. So they really have a lot of trust in their employers at this time, trust that they're doing the right things and that they're communicating what they need to know at the right times and through the right channels. And with that in mind, their expectation is that they would hear from them at least once a day. And that may seem like a lot. And I know that we've got a lot of questions around, over communication and how many emails is too many, but your teams want to hear from you at least once a day, whether that's from your CEO, their team leads, an individual they work with. Just make sure you're communicating facts and information, as well as messages of empathy and compassion with them at least once daily.
When you think about how important it is, and even our team at Jackson Spalding trying to have a cadence of constant communication, once you have your team feeling really good, then it's how as a team do you communicate that cadence externally. So once you have the internal settled, and we've had a number of questions about, exactly how frequent do we communicate externally? One of the questions was, what is a general frequency and how we should communicate with clients about COVID-19? And what about the level of detail? Is it short and sweet? Is it long and detailed? Especially, one question said, especially when you want to provide updates that are relevant to your business relationship with someone, but you want to be respectful of the other areas of your partner's business that are being impacted. So how would you guys respond to exactly how we manage that cadence of external comms?
I'll start, Heather.
Okay, thanks, Bryan.
As you can imagine, there's no one size fits all approach to the proper cadence at a time like this, but I think there's a few things to consider and almost think of as a checklist for us as we're going through and looking at that. First is, what's our historical frequency? How often do we communicate with our clients in a normal time? And that really is establishing our baseline. We don't need to try to keep up with the Joneses. Just because you see a lot of emails coming from a competitor, if that's not the normal cadence you've established with your customers, you want to see a variance off of that original baseline. And we want to be the brand that communicates the right amount of times. And when we get that email that feels off, we know it, and your customers know you in that way. Two, we want to understand our relevance at this time. As an example, if you sell snow cones, you don't want to buy ads in the winter. In the same way, everyday life has been upended right now, and we need to adjust accordingly. If you're a B2B business that consults with clients on tax matters, your clients better hear from you early and often. But if you sell sightseeing tours, you're going to back off a little bit and know that your time is going to come again a little later. The third is really the timeliness of the specific communication. And this is really important right now, because one conversation that I've had personally with many clients is to take a document, take an ad, take an email, and read it as you are future you. You are reading this 2 weeks, a month from now, and this situation has gotten worse. How does that email, how does that ad, how does that communication age? If it's still relevant, then run with it. If not, then put it in your back pocket. There will be a time for that communication. And the last thing I would say from a cadence standpoint, but really gets to more of how you do it, is the method of communication. We're all separated now, and many people are craving a personal touch. So if you're in a service business, pick up the phone and call your clients right now. Text them. If you are got a lot of people with time on their hand, divide and conquer. Make sure that every one of your clients hears from someone personally at your organization this week or next week. If you're on social, DM your customers, send handwritten notes, personal emails. Let this build relationships. Just saying, how are you doing, is sometimes the single greatest business development tool any company is going to have in this crisis.
It's interesting you say that, Bryan, because I think a lot of us have experienced an inundation of communication with every brand we've ever interacted with, and even the ones we didn't think we ever interacted with. Someone who sent us an email or some form of communication. But for me, it's been the personal touches. If you know and understand your clients and your customers, like, ask how they are doing. I mean, just being a regular human being. And I think so many people are extra in tune to the sensitivity around that. One question we received was, can you discuss the sensitivity to the current global pandemic and the corresponding need to continue moving forward work activities? So the sensitivity around what's going on with COVID-19 and how businesses still need to move forward with work activities.
Heather, I can jump in on that one first. So that is a serious question, and it really speaks to a lot of the challenge that we're facing right now. Social distancing means let's separate as much as we can so that we can stop the spread of coronavirus and COVID-19. Moving forward with operations, depending on your company, would mean that you have employees who are going out there and working. And so people are trying to figure out, how do you practice good social distancing while still moving forward? You know, I think this really speaks to the importance of the marriage between communications and operations. Operations is making those decisions. Communications is really figuring out how you're going to tell people inside your business and outside your business about those decisions. Specifically, we can't give specific advice because we need to know more about the individual situation each business is in. But I would say in general, you have to, as Bryan said, make sure that communications has a seat at the table, so that when operations, be it your chief operating officer or whoever it is in charge of operations, is recommending, okay, this is what we need to do to make sure that our people are working, then your communications team can come in and help you to look through the pros and cons of those actions. If you do this, here is the good that can come out of it, or if you do this, here is the unintended consequence that can come from this. So I think really at the end of the day, it comes to making sure that communications and operations are working together before decisions are finalized and before they're announced to your internal and external audiences.
One of the questions that we had received was, well, really not just one. I mean, honestly, I think we had half a dozen, all about brand news. We're talking about this inundation of how we specifically communicate to COVID-19 and social distancing in this really new climate that our world is living in. But at the same time, a lot of brands are still, well, how do we talk about balancing our brand news with COVID-19 related information? So a question asks, is it appropriate to share brand news at a time like this?
Yeah, Heather, I mean, the answer is it really depends. And again, like Bryan said earlier, this isn't a one size fits all time. And it really is something that you have to look at on a case by case basis. But I would say first, and just to reiterate what we've been saying already this afternoon, first, before you do anything else, make sure your operations and internal communications are shored up. Make sure your operations are functioning as well as they can at this time, and that your internal teams feel good about what they are doing, how they're contributing, what their role is, what they know. And then it's the time to think about whether or not your brand has a voice either in this conversation. And that could mean, does your company offer something that would bring some cheer right now? People need to hear about joyful things. Do you offer a service that people need right now or that's helpful? Are you doing something good in the community? And do you want to get the word out about that in a way that is sensitive to the situation at hand? Just make sure that you really have a reason to have a voice in the conversation. If you don't, it will definitely come off as being tone deaf in this time. And so we just really want to caution that you look at that. Like Bryan said, from 2 weeks from now, does that conversation look appropriate, or does it look like you were tone deaf to the situation around you? And also just looking to see what's happening around you in your space. What are your competitors doing? We're doing a lot of benchmarking right now for our clients on what others in their space are doing. And we don't necessarily want to be first at the table with an idea, but we're looking to see, okay, does this make sense in the context of what others are doing? And also looking at the company values and corporate purpose for inspiration. So, are you a caring company? Then maybe that means you should do something to give back and talk about that. Are your products designed to do something special that maybe helps people cope in these times? And if so, share some inspiring ideas for them to spend time with their families or get outside, socially distance, of course. So just look at your brand and what makes sense for you from a brand perspective in terms of your purpose, your values. Stay true to who you are, but really look through that lens of, am I offering something that's valid in light of the current conversation?
Talking about that, Kim, obviously we are all calling in from our homes. We may have dogs or cats at our feet. Charles had a power outage earlier today. We're all really juggling this kind of new normal. And so much of how we interact right now is digitally. And a huge part of that is social media. We had several folks ask, how exactly should my company handle social media during this time?
Yeah, and Heather, I'll take that. And yeah, I had a power outage earlier today, and sometimes you just have to roll with it until you can. When plan A doesn't work, you go to plan B. Sometimes you figure plan B out on the fly. Life throws punches and you roll with them. But when it comes to social media and crisis, there's really three things that we try to think about. The first is you want to monitor. You want to monitor what the current conversation is. What are your audience members talking about? What is the bigger audience on social media talking about as well? Then you want to assess. You basically want to figure out, do we have a voice in this conversation? Do we have, as Kim said, do we have a service, a thought that makes sense, a thought that can really help people during this time? And Bryan used the example of a sightseeing tour. If you monitor and you assess, maybe you realize you're not going to push anything out at this particular time because there's not any extra value that you can provide to the greater conversation, and that's okay. You sometimes you want to fight the urge of communicating unless there's something valuable to communicate about. So one of the things that we've developed within our crisis team is this idea of monitor, assess, and push. I think you want to monitor the current conversation, then you want to assess whether or not you can bring value to the conversation. And if you can, you want to put out a message that is very on tone with the current conversation or not, just depending on what you've monitored. You know, we're seeing a lot of companies right now who their goal and their job is to run large assembly plants and make things. And because consumer demand in some aspects of our economy have slowed down, but they still have a valuable service of an assembly plant. So they're retrofitting their operations to make things that are needed during this time. I think communications on social can be the same way. Even if your organization doesn't have necessarily a voice in the current conversation, you do have large audiences on social media. So maybe you can use those to push out the message of social distancing, to push out the message of shelter in place, if shelter in place is happening in your particular state. So it may not be the message that's valuable, it may be the audience you have that's valuable. I think it's really just coming down to figuring out what is the value that you can provide and trying to provide that during this time.
I would add to that, just in terms of the sightseeing mentioned, just made me think of something that I actually saw today on social media, and with people not being able to travel and missing all the beautiful places around the world. If you're a sightseeing company, maybe you don't market your services right now, but show some inspiring pictures of places that you've taken guests in the past, and just be there for the beauty of it and not to get anything out of it, but just, you know, share sites around the world that eventually people are definitely going to want to go back and see, and inspire people to want to do that when we get through all of this. So I think, you know, that's really important. I also just want to reiterate how important it is. We've seen a few clients that have had this happen to them, and certainly many case studies about scheduled content. Make sure you unschedule your content. You don't want to push anything out right now that's not relevant, or that, again, comes across as tone deaf, or that was just, it is an accident, and that can really be damaging to your brand.
Thanks, Kim and Charles. One area we want to kind of backtrack to is we talked a little bit about operations. We received, I feel, about 5 to 10 questions specifically about operational decisions within the organization. So Bryan, I think you touched on this, Charles as well. Bryan, could you kind of elaborate more on some of those situations that we've managed like this in the past 2 or 3 weeks?
Absolutely. As our founder, Glenn Jackson, likes to say, we want to be trusted advisors. And I think that's the easiest way to describe what we do. I teach a class at the University of Georgia every fall. And one of the things I tell students very early in the semester is that I don't want my clients making a decision on where to go on vacation, what hotel to stay at, where to eat dinner without consulting me first. And that's not in our contract. We want to be the people that our clients call when they're making really tough decisions. And we've seen that a lot lately. And again, not getting into specific client names, but everybody is impacted by this. And no one could have foreseen it. So, I mean, I was dealing with a food service client a couple weeks ago, and they operated multiple cities. Some of them had shelter in place, some of them didn't. So how are we going to operate differently from one market to the next? We talked through it. Then it became, okay, everybody in this state is going to be dining room closed. How do we modify there? And how do we adjust our operations there? It then became, we're going to have to shut our doors. Right now, the decision is, how do we make sure we take care of our employees? What do we do with our perishables? What do we do with all those cleaning supplies that the community needs right now? So it became from an operation decision to really a CSR decision, where we were really saying, how can we impact the community in a great way? And then what do we do with our land? We got big plots of land that are sitting empty. Those are the kinds of operations decisions that are being made that we are then informing the communications on. We deal with education groups from daycare through college, and many of them started with simply, do we close our schools? And if we do, then how do we communicate to our students and our faculty who are now scattered? And if you're dealing with a higher education institution, you're dealing with students who might be from many states, but a faculty and a staff that live here full time, and you have staffed up your institution to handle 10, 20,000 students who are now gone. And how do we do that? How do we communicate to them? How do we communicate with compassion that things have changed? And then, down to the lowest level of daycare. I mean, do we keep our daycare open? What do we do for all these essential workers who are having to go into work and their kids are out of school? There's a service we provide. Another really interesting one that's actually been kind of fun over the last couple of days is we have an e-commerce company who at the beginning it was, how do we serve our customers, and who works from home, and what happens if we need to ship products, but products can't be shipped. And we've been able to talk with them and hear them work it through. A lot of times, again, as that trusted advisor, we're just being the ones there to listen and let them work through these problems themselves. And again, there is no one right answer. We just have to carefully consider all the variables. A lot of the times we're the one in the room saying, what if this? What if this? Have we considered this? And then it's our job to work with the leadership once a decision's made to communicate it with clarity and compassion. And if people on this call hear nothing else, I want you to understand we can't Monday morning quarterback in the midst of a crisis. We have to make a decision, move forward based on that decision. When this is over, we can go back and reevaluate what could we have done better, how could we have changed. But everything is moving so fast that companies are making very big operational decisions. We have to communicate them, don't look back, move forward, and do the best we can in a situation none of us have ever experienced before.
Thanks, Bryan. I know you talked about clarity and compassion. Another question we received was, how do you maintain and grow stakeholder engagement while being intentional to not appear like another organization who's making a desperate plea for support? Also, in the same vein, how that relates to salespeople and the work that they do.
Heather, I can add on a little bit there, and I realize that there is a real internal struggle for a lot of businesses right now because they're getting the real-time impacts of this from a financial perspective, and they're wanting to make sure that they can keep their lights on as well. So I think the internal desire to communicate to market services is something that is really important. I do understand that. I think it really comes down to what is your unique value proposition? I'll give an example. We've all been watching the federal stimulus package as it's moved through Congress and as the president has signed it. So the next question is, what is in this package that helps business and that helps people? And so if you are a law firm, for example, and you have an employment lawyer on staff, that employment lawyer is probably going to be very, very important right now in terms of being able to analyze the bill as it's written and figure out how it's going to affect your clients and your clients' employees. So I think just taking a good look at what the conversation is right now, and do you have a service that you can provide that speaks to a client need? If you do, then I think it just comes down to how you communicate. And that is really the case before COVID-19 was something that we were all dealing with. You want to make sure that you're speaking directly to your client's needs at this particular time.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Want to be mindful again of everyone's time. We've got about 16 minutes left in our session today, so we're going to continue to move through a number of these questions. If we don't get to them again, we will reply back to you and continue to send them to realtalk@jacksonspalding.com. Another question that feels kind of obvious, but someone asked, do we even need to be a part of the conversation as a brand on COVID-19, given that there is so much communication and email clutter already?
Yeah, so The answer again is yes and no. Again, it's just not a one size fits all. But what I would say first is consider who your audiences are as the first step. So map out your audiences. If you haven't already thought through it, sit down and list out on a piece of paper every audience that you can possibly think of, and then prioritize those audiences. So are there stakeholders on that list who maybe you didn't consider initially when this hit because you were so busy communicating internally? Or maybe you were focused on external audiences because you serve a direct consumer need and your customers were being faced with situations where your stores are closed, or some of your frontline employees maybe were getting sick and you had to communicate to them. So now is really a good time to reevaluate what your core audiences are and how often and what you are communicating with those core audiences. So there may have been stakeholders in the first round of doing that analysis that you didn't even think of. And then make sure that you're not over communicating. But again, I think everybody's sensitive to that because they're seeing so many emails come into their inbox from other brands. But know that there are people who want to hear from you directly, and just make sure the cadence is appropriate with the cadence you've communicated with them in the past. Make sure that you're being transparent, and make sure that your messages are one of reassurance and reassuring your audience, whoever that may be, whether internal, external partner, that your operations are either going ahead as normal or whatever's happening with those operations. Make sure to communicate that clearly, and also with a sense of compassion and information.
All right, another question we just received. How do we simplify terminology when distinguishing between the novel coronavirus and the disease COVID-19, especially as we're thinking optimistically about getting to a place of managing the disease and hopefully the near future? How do we, differentiate between those two terms?
Yeah, Heather, I think that's really interesting. When it comes to the word novel, I think all of us non-public health people were thinking about books before COVID-19. But I think now, we've all gotten a little bit of a public health education on terms. And I think that's because we've been looking towards the trusted sources on this information, being the CDC and the WHO. And so I do understand that there may be an importance with some people to simplify these terms, but I think you've got to understand that you are a part of a national, if not international, conversation where public health experts are using these terms. And so we've got to stick with the trusted sources of the CDC and WHO for that information. I think this also speaks to when we talk about trusted sources, Chani Aguilera runs our healthcare practice at Jackson Spalding. And so she's talked a lot with us internally about making sure that we're using the proper information and getting it from the proper places. So I think using the source material is important when it comes to terminology.
We're providing those resources as a team to bring clarification on glossary terms in our daily briefs that we're sending out to our clients. And so I think that's important, as well as for the internal and external messaging. All right, let's keep powering through. Next question, are corporate communications and MarCom clients, or marketing communication clients, communicating sufficiently during the crisis to their supplier partner base, which they will again desperately turn to when that new normal sets in after all of the dust settles with COVID-19?
Yeah, on this one, again, I would say it kind of depends. And I do think that people have been very focused, as they should be, on making sure that operations and internal communications are handled first. And that's where we would want everyone to be focused at the beginning of this inform part of this crisis. As we get to the next phase and the calming phase, that's a time where your partners and suppliers and other stakeholders really can rally together to find solutions. And so what I would say is, if you haven't already started to communicate with those suppliers and partners, and it probably depends on your business, make sure to include them in that list of stakeholders I mentioned before, your audiences, and communicate with them at a regular cadence, not just when you need something from them. They can really be a solution to some of the business problems that you may be facing. And also unlikely solutions may come from them that you may have not even thought of before. So for example, one of our clients is a manufacturer, and they were looking at manufacturing masks in one of their facilities and realized through reaching out to some of their suppliers that they actually had a line on getting prefabricated P95 masks from this supplier at a reduced cost from what the local healthcare system was going to have to pay. And they were able to procure those masks for them at a lower price. And so they were able to equip the local health system just via one of their normal supplier relationships, while they were also shifting manufacturing to make masks. And so they were able to kind of help from two fronts. And that was really important to them as part of their corporate values, that they be able to help the local community. So think about it in that way. And obviously your partners want to help too. And so if there's a mutual business congruency that you can come together and really help solve a problem in your community or for your team members, we absolutely encourage you to have regular communications with those suppliers.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, so this one's kind of relevant even for us here today. Questions about events. In the case that there are events that have converted to being online, like this one, how do you stay on message without exploiting the situation, especially or in consideration of regards to fundraising for a cause?
Let me break that kind of into two different things. I think the first part of that, what I see is it relates to nonprofits. Let's talk about them first. Many of them, this has been a gut punch. You know, many of the events that they have are actually their large fundraisers, the cookouts, the 5Ks, the art exhibits, and those things raise their revenue for the year, and they're just gone. And as the economy tightens, they also know that their donations are going to go down. So they're going to have to get creative and move those engagements to a virtual environment. And we're seeing that happen around the country. And remember that these groups exist because there is a need, and they feel called to serve that need, and that need is still there. So if you serve, I've seen a lot of ads, interestingly lately, for the ASPCA and animal shelters. All of these nonprofits still serve a need, and we have to understand that we don't need to be afraid to ask in this time, and don't look at giving as a zero-sum game. Just because people are giving to healthcare things doesn't mean they still can't support other things as well. Now, on the flip side, there's many businesses and entertainment that put on large events, and this is harder. This pandemic became real for many Americans when the NBA had to cancel its games. And then the cascade of cancellations afterwards from South by Southwest, the Masters, the Final Four, concerts throughout America. It's going to be harder for those groups to start marketing because the end isn't on a date. If we all knew right now that opening day would be on June 15th, or that my favorite store would open on July 1st, we would have something to look forward to. We would have something to communicate against, and we would have an end in sight, but we're just not there yet. So what we're doing is seeing many leagues and organizations working hard to remain top of mind in a world where people are being inundated. And the good thing here for those groups to remember is that when this is over, that part of the economy will explode. And we just need to be here and persevere. And when we get there, be ready for that explosion to happen.
I think talking a lot about that factor about humanity, these desires that we as consumers, as people at home are hoping, wishing for. And a question that really touches on that we received was, how can our company pursue clients to use our services and balance empathy without being perceived as an ambulance chaser? Quite a term there.
Yeah, you know, I think that speaks to tension that a lot of companies are facing right now. You know, they don't want to capitalize on this situation, and I think it's right not to capitalize on the situation. But if you have a service that people need right now, then I think you just have to say, okay, who are our clients? We have to focus on our audience. Who is it that we're talking to? And if the more you know your clients, the more you realize what their needs are. And then you're using that as an opportunity to say, it sounds like this is what you need. We have something that we think you do need, and we want to provide it to you. I think also doing a little bit of research, and just like Bryan talked about, picking up the phone and talking to people to get a sense of what they need. You can do it that way as well, but also just being aware of your surroundings and seeing what the current conversation is going to help you to determine, number one, what is the greater need that people have during this time? And then two, do we have a service in-house that can help serve that need? And if we can't, then maybe we just have to miss out on that part of the conversation. So I think being even more fine-tuned and more narrow with your outreach is going to be important, but that means it's more directed and more targeted to the clients you need.
Thanks, Charles. We're going to squeeze in one more question and then wrap up with some final thoughts. A lot of talk is about CSR. We've mentioned it earlier in the conversation. A question was, how do you believe organizations can make a positive impact in their communities at the same time while everyone is afraid to come in contact with one another?
Heather, it's a great question. And I'm going to take a 50,000-foot view of CSR here. And I'm going to tell everyone on this call to start by working on the inside out. Many of your employees and their families are being impacted by this, and your CSR actually starts with them. They're your people, and it will look shallow if you're not addressing their needs first. As one of our team members, Robin Hubier, said earlier today in an email, before you consider any external community engagement, your CSR team should ensure the people closest to you, to your business, are receiving the care they need. So look inside first. And then second, look at what is most natural to your business. What do you do? What do you do well? And for some, this is literal, as Kim was talking about earlier. Companies that are making PPEs. We're seeing auto manufacturers starting to manufacture ventilators. There's specific things core to your business that are needed right now, and make sure that that's CSR. And then for others, you're going to have to get creative. You know, I mentioned that e-commerce company earlier. They sell luxury watches. It's not necessarily a need right now, but they wanted to find a way to help. So they partnered with the Giving Kitchen in Atlanta, and Alton Brown, the celebrity chef, donated multiple watches to the Giving Kitchen, which they're auctioning off and raising thousands of dollars for food service workers. So look at what you do as a business and say, how can we use that to raise money, to raise awareness, as Charles said earlier? And then finally, going back to the inside, getting back to your people, how can you use their downtime to impact for good? There's not going to be a whole lot of group home builds happening right now, as the commenter asked. So we've seen great stories of people reading to children online, people getting on the phone and calling shut-ins, or using their exercise time to go out and pick up trash along the side of the road. Encouraging these activities, companies encouraging their people to do these things as part of the normal workday, and then sharing them internally. It's going to build morale for your organization, and it's going to remind people that you're part of a bigger team, even though you may not be able to hammer a nail right next to them.
I think I've heard a lot of it is that we're all in this together, but in all actuality, we really are. So let's talk about the future in closing. Even when there is so much uncertainty right now, I feel like that term has been used a lot. There's a lot of uncertainty, unknowns. So this question is for everybody. How do we look around the corner? What's next?
So I kind of pride myself on being a good prognosticator, but definitely in these times, I'm just as lost as everyone. And we, I think, have pretty good predictive analytics and other tools that we can use within our industry to see where things are headed. And this is just one that's undefinable. I mean, it's just bizarre. From day to day, you don't know what's going to come. So what I would say is what's within your control is to be able to know what's going on around you, to know what's happening in your industry, and to stay tuned to the news. I know it can be difficult sometimes, especially working in this business. Watching the news all day can be a downer, but make sure that you're watching for the nuggets that are relevant to your business, to what you do each day, and take something away from it that is helpful to you rather than just hearing all the scary facts and figures. There is good news out there. People are innovating so quickly. It's really tremendous to see. and just watching your industry, watching what your competition is doing in a different way. Maybe look at it with a different lens, but just really look at what everyone is doing. And then again, like I said before, filter it through what are your company's values, what is your purpose, and what makes sense for you out of the information that you're calling. One of the tools Heather mentioned earlier, we're doing a daily briefing for our clients, and we're trying to help cull down a lot of that information for our clients by industry specifically, as well as some of the kind of early leaders and innovating in this space to give some inspirational ideas as well. So if you're not receiving our daily briefing, definitely sign up for it. I think it's been super helpful to a lot of our clients.
Bryan?
Building off what Kim was saying, I really want to, in this time, preach caution to our clients. We don't have to be the first mover here. We're all going to come out of this, but we don't have to be first. You know, the old phrase, the early bird gets the worm. Also remember that the early worm gets eaten. And we don't have to necessarily be the first store to open our doors. We don't have to be the first restaurant to allow people back in the dining room. We need to see where the industry's going. We need to see where the government and where the healthcare community is telling us where we can go, and do not get ahead of it. We all are so desperate to get out of this that we want to be first. We want to capitalize. When is the stock market plummeted so I can buy stocks at the bottom? When can I do all of these things I've been wanting to do? And there will be a time for that. And I'm not saying be so cautious that you let the moment pass you by, but do not get ahead of the experts in this, because this is unprecedented. This idea of flattening the curve is not something any of us had heard of 3 weeks ago. And now it's something we're all in together. So if anything I want to preach to our clients and the people watching this right now is you don't have to be the first mover, just also don't be the last.
Thanks, Bryan. Charles, you want to wrap us up?
So just in closing, I'll say that there's no company without people. And so your company has to focus on internal communications now more than ever. Everybody throughout this has been thinking about, how does this affect me as a person? Your employees are thinking the same thing. Kim mentioned the fact that employers are seen as extremely trusted right now. And so just make sure that you're focusing on your employees, taking care of them, answering the questions that they have, and serving them at this time. No company is in existence without employees.
Thanks, Charles. Thank you all for attending this first Real Talk webinar. Really appreciate it of our panelists and providing their time. A lot of people at Jackson Spalding behind the scenes. We received a number of questions during this conversation and leading up to it. So if your question did not get answered, or maybe you have some new questions after listening, please email us at realtalk@jacksonspalding.com, and someone from our team would be happy to get back with you. You can also email Real Talk to sign up for those daily COVID-19 briefings that Kim just mentioned. We also send a weekly newsletter, Think Brief. Many of you registered for the webinar through that, so you can sign up right here on our website. We're going to be sharing a recap of this, as well as a recording of the video here today. We'll be sharing that out with everyone tomorrow. I just want to say, on behalf of the entire team at Jackson Spalding, thank you guys for making time for joining us. Thank you for calling in from your homes with your kids, your pets, your work. We hope that you stay well, and we really look forward to seeing you at the next webinar and continuing these conversations. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks.